Boys and girls, good morning to you all. And just wanted to mention one more thing from yesterday's story. And I realized overnight I should have said something a little bit more. You remember how we contrasted the two gardens? There's the Garden Gethsemane. That's the garden of Jesus' suffering, where he was taking upon all the sins of those who believe on him. But we contrasted that with the Garden of Eden. Remember the Garden of Eden, where our first parents lived, Adam and Eve? It was a garden of God's favor, of God's blessing. There was no suffering there. But I wanted to add one more thing, and that is Jesus went into the garden of suffering so that everyone who believes in him can enter into that new garden again. So I want to make that really, really clear. For all who believe in him, we can enter into that new garden again. That's what we mean by heaven, or the new heaven and the new earth. So it's a beautiful parallels. You see the Garden of Eden, the Garden of Gethsemane, and the new garden to come for believe. Anyway, let's move on to the next story. And that story has to deal with Peter. It's called Just One Look. Now, before I get into the story, I want to ask you a question. You know, sometimes when your father or your mother, sometimes they look at you, they don't say a word. And when they look at you, you know you did something wrong. And you know that they know that your mom and dad know you did something wrong, right? They don't have to say a word. Well, that's what we're going to talk about today. Although you have to listen really carefully, because we're not going to necessarily reach that point until we get to the end of the story. But we continue. But now we're no longer on the road with Jesus, are we? We're no longer walking with Jesus on the road toward the cross. What has happened is the soldiers took Jesus, and now the disciples ran away. They fled. So what does that mean, boys and girls? Jesus is walking on the road toward the cross, all alone, all by himself. You know, the disciples, they were afraid that the soldiers might catch them too, so they hid. But there's two disciples, however, who quietly followed the soldiers as they were taking Jesus away. You know which two they were? You know which two they are? It was Peter and John. You can just hear as the soldiers are taking Jesus away, they're probably some distance behind, and they're walking quietly, some distance behind the soldiers and Jesus, but they don't want to be seen. And finally, they see where they're taking Jesus. They're taking him to a big house. And the big house is where Caiaphas, the big high priest, lives. He's sort of, you could say, the boss of all the religious authorities among the Jews. That's where they take Jesus. Now, as they see them take Jesus into the house, Peter and John keep on following. Peter is not quite sure whether they should go into the house or not. He's afraid. But John, he knows the servant girl, that servant girl who works for the high priest Caiaphas. And so he knocks on the door. And who enters the door? Who answers the door? The servant girl. And he asks, "May I come in with my friend?" And she lets them in. And it's this very same place where Jesus is being held, the same house. They're in a different room, a different part, but it's the same house where Jesus is being held. Now, Peter is afraid. He thinks this is really dangerous. It's scary because he's in the house of the enemy. And one thing he's thinking about all the time, I hope they don't think that I'm one of his disciples. I hope they don't find out that I'm one of his disciples, that I'm one of those who follow Jesus. Because They might grab me also. But what really spooked Peter out is that servant girl. She stared at him as if, I know who he is. But anyway, Peter, being a little bit spooked, he walked by the servant girl, and then he went into the inner court. The inner court was a big area that was kind of open to the sky. He walked in there, and it was dark outside, but there was a fire burning in the center of the inner court. And who was sitting around there? All the soldiers were sitting around there, warming themselves by the fire. And Peter, he wanted to blend in. He wanted to pretend that he was just like one of them. And so he too also sat with them and enjoying the warmth of the fire and pretending to be resting and leaning back. But you know what? Next door, there was a room. It was open. And there he was watching Jesus. And as he was watching Jesus, I mean, he could really see what was going on in that room where Jesus was. There his hands were bound with ropes, bound with chains. And there he was standing before the priests, in front of all the priests. That made him nervous. And now that servant girl whom he passed by, now she comes in and sits by him by the fire. She looks at Peter. She says, aren't you one of his disciples? Aren't you one of his followers? Peter was startled. He was shocked. He's thinking, well, what if one of the soldiers takes me? What if I'm going to be taken and captured? He says, disciple of Jesus? How should I? Of course not. I should say not. I don't even know the man. What did Peter do, boys and girls? He denied Jesus the first time. Peter, he becomes more afraid than ever, more afraid than he was even before. Now he's thinking, I better not stay in this dangerous place any longer. And what does he do? He leaves the inner court and he's ready to walk out the door. And who does he meet again? Well, there's the servant girl by the door talking with one of the soldiers. And she's talking to that soldier and says, see this guy over here? He belongs to Jesus. And again, Peter's very afraid. No, girl, that is simply not true. I don't know this man at all. Boys and girls, do you think Peter was lying? He was lying. Worse than that, he was denying the Lord Jesus Christ. This is the second time that he lied. This is the second time he was denying the Lord Jesus Christ, that he was a follower of Christ. But Peter, he didn't dare go out the door. He thought, well, if I go out the door now, I might be caught, I might be grabbed, I might be captured, and also bound and chained. He was so afraid. So what does he do? He doesn't know what to do. Should he go this way? Should he go that way? He's in a frenzy. But he tries to act calmly and pretends to be in control of the situation. And he goes back into the inner court. And he sits back and he's going to sit with the soldiers and warm himself by the fire. And he looked toward the Lord Jesus. And he sees how the priests are treating him. And he's thinking, if I'm captured and I'm treated that way, I'm already seeing how they will beat me as they're beating Jesus. So here they're beating Jesus, and there's blood coming down from all the beatings. But Peter continues to pretend that he's just one of the crowd, one of the soldiers. And all at once, one of the soldiers asks, yeah, you are one of his disciples, aren't you? Oh, no, says Peter. Of course not. And then another soldier, after all the other soldiers were staring at him, another soldier said to him, yes, but I saw you in the garden. I saw you in the Garden of Gethsemane. It's a lie, shouted Peter. I don't even know the man. I am not his disciple. And then to make sure that the men would believe him, he swore that he did not know Jesus. This was the third time that this is the third time that Peter denied the Lord Jesus. And you know what happened? All of a sudden, the rooster crowed. Rooster crowed, and Peter heard it. What did the Lord Jesus say? Before the rooster crows, you will have denied me 3 times. What happens? Jesus is standing in that room before the priests, and he turns his face, and he looked at Peter with great sorrow. He never said a word. He looked at Peter as Peter was looking at him. Now, boys and girls, what do you think those eyes of Jesus said? It was as like the eyes of Jesus was looking directly into his heart, directly inside of him. That look caused Peter to remember what he had said. He said that he would never deny his Lord. He said that he would even give his life. He'd even be willing to die for Jesus. And now he remembered what Jesus said. No, before the rooster crows, when the rooster crows, you will know that you have denied me 3 times. And now Peter remembers. Peter knows that he has sinned against Jesus. It was a look that made him realize that he knew, but also it was a look that he knew that Jesus knew. Just one look, and that was enough. And what did Peter do? He went out and he cried and he cried and he cried. Lord Jesus, he says, what have I done? I thought I was one of the most important disciples, but now I'm one of the worst. I'm by far the worst. Dear Lord Jesus, please forgive me. Boys and girls, there's a lot more to the story yet. We have to wait for that. But we do know later that Jesus did have compassion on him and he forgave him. But just one question I want to ask you today. Jesus looks at Peter, right? Just one look. Why was that look important? Why was that look so important? What if Jesus had not looked? Think about what might have happened. Okay, why was that look so important?